best of biology. Summer edition. Alright, so today we're going to start off our episode with a little thought experiment. So today we're going to be talking about foraging, which is really just obtaining food and energy, right? Now, let's say that we all just walked into a giant, enormous, beautiful buffet. Now, as we walk into that buffet, you are allowed to pick any foods that you want on that plate. What I'd like you to do right now is I'd like you to pause the video and I'd like you to write down the foods that would be on that plate. Pause it. Alright, so now that we have our list that's all finished up and we got our food that's on our plate, what I'd also like you to do is, because we understand macromolecules at this point, I'd like you to write down a little note about which macromolecules exist in what foods. And I'd also like you to make a note on what kinds of variety do you actually have. Do you have lots and lots of carbs, lipids, or proteins? Do you have like an even balance? What's going on? So write all those things down for a second, take a moment, write the things down, and then we'll come back to our topic for today. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to put our list aside and we're going to learn about our topic and come back to this in a little bit and try and assess what kinds of foods do we actually choose to grab, and was it really a benefit when we actually chose those foods, or were we just choosing them because, oh, well, they were really good? Do we think that maybe there might be a more efficient way to get that balanced and beautiful little diet? Alright, so today we're going to learn about the optimal foraging theorem, which in short is OFT. We've already been learning about how different ecosystems are really just a giant, large network of organisms operating with different niches that are competing, interacting with each other so that they can obtain different amounts or different types of energy. Well, OFT is a theory that explains not just how food gives these organisms energy. It is actually a theory that's truly trying to explain how an organism obtains this energy, but not just what it does with this energy, but truly how it obtains the energy, the distance it travels to get the energy, and the time it takes to forage or obtain that energy. So it makes a lot of sense that if energy is currency, how you spending it, and what's the benefit? Cost and benefits. It really means that OFT is trying to explain the idea that if there's always a cost and a benefit to all the energy that we get from our food, then how are organisms going about getting the food, and what are they going to do when they get it? So how are they going to use it? Alright, so when we actually think about OFT itself as an equation, really OFT is the equation that load profit is over foraging travel plus foraging time. What that really means when it comes down to it is an animal is spending a whole bunch of time to get its food, and an animal has to travel to actually get its food. So the question comes that, is it spending an efficient amount of time and travel to actually get a profit, load profit? Is it spending enough time to get that energy so it ends up coming up with a bigger number? OFT, theoretically, what it's really trying to do is trying to actually maximize this OFT result, this number that we get of load profit over travel and time. And we're trying to get that number to be kind of large if we want to think about it, because it makes a lot of sense. An animal does not want to spend a lot of time traveling or a whole bunch of time obtaining its food when it gets it if it's not worth it. Now, breakdown number one, if we think about this, load profit itself is really a term that means what do we get in energy from the load or food that we're actually obtaining from our niche or from our ecosystem. Now, if we start looking at the term foraging travel, well, this is all about the distance that an organism travels to obtain that energy. Now, this is a huge deal because it really discusses the distance and therefore the energy that's spent, cost, of that particular organism's energy load to get that benefit in the travel that it takes to get the energy. Think about it like this. If you were hungry and you had fifth period off, you might go to King Soopers to get yourself some food. Now, the thing is that the food at King Soopers, well, it's okay. Maybe I want a sandwich in a package. Maybe I don't, right? But on the other hand, ooh, Mexicali is calling your name and you want a burrito from Baseline. And so now you're going to actually take some time and travel to actually get over to Mexicali. But the question is, which one's better? Burrito or that little packet sandwich at King Soopers? So the big question is if we didn't have to care about the cost of it all, which one would you choose? Now, one of the big deals after we've already learned about the equation of OFT and we've taken into consideration what it really means to have foraging be optimal with travel and time in consideration to this, is we got to start thinking about how we would actually deal with this in an experimental way. Because theory and experiment are very different things. The cool thing is your teacher, this guy, this summer, actually did an experiment to test out OFT with some other young scientists. What a beautiful thing. Alright, so here's how it went down. Me and a few young scientists were hanging out in the Mountain Research Center in Ned this summer, and we were trying to test OFT, and we thought to ourselves, well, what kind of mammal could we test really quick and really easy so we could try and figure out some kind of situation, some kind of pattern that would develop based on OFT. So we decided to test squirrels. Now, squirrels are really easy. They're all over the place. There's all these trees everywhere around. And the cool thing about squirrels is this. They have these things called middens, as you see behind me. And middens themselves are really just these giant piles of huge like pine cone litter. They've just like eaten all the seeds of the pine cones, they toss the pine cone away. But the thing is that a squirrel has a home tree normally. So in this home tree, these squirrels have been feeding for like years of their lives. So now all of a sudden you have a midden that is this giant thing, this huge pile that you can actually lay on. Look at me. Now, the deal is this, with our middens, we decided that if we could figure out what was in the middens, what was actually identifiable as what kinds of trees, consistent with what kinds of pine cone crap that we found underneath the trees, then we could figure out maybe the distance between the nearest trees from their home tree and see how much travel did they actually throw in to trying to obtain that particular food. And so how we set up our particular experiment is we would walk randomly through the forest, we'd find a midden. Once we found a midden and a squirrel's home tree, then what we ended up doing was we took these 15-meter tapes and basically we measured, after we looked at all the midden and we identified the primary percentages of each kind of tree that was there, we started to measure to the first 3 trees that we could find that were around that area, right, in that given radius of that particular home tree. And we were trying to see what was the distance between it and how did that link up to the percentage of the food that they actually had in their area, right? one would think, if we're looking at the optimal foraging theorem, that the tree that is going to be selected is going to be a very close tree, and we're probably going to find more of that particular food source at their home tree right near them, right? Because they don't want to travel too far to actually get their food. But the deal is too, is this, that they also want variety. So they might actually have some variety of species, and how far are those trees away from them, right? Because if they want variety, are they willing to travel and put forth the time to obtain that food and energy? So the cool thing is after we took all that data and we processed that data for about a week, we did about 200-300 trees in total, we ended up finding out that there was actually a really cool trend. The average distance versus our little OFT equation, that number was getting really large, right? Because remember, we want that denominator to be really small. We want the travel time and the travel distance to be low. And we want the food, right, how much food they've got, to be really high on the top of the equation, right? So we started to see that these numbers were really big for particular trees. In particular, lodgepole pines up in Netherlands are really common. And squirrels seem to prefer lodgepole pines over any other kind. Now, we also found ponderosa pines, we found Engelmann spruce that were inside those particular middens that we found, right, and we assessed. But they had a particular preference for these particular trees, lodgepoles, that is. And not only that, they ended up having a majority, like 80%, 70%, 90% of their middens were consistent of these particular trees that were really close to them. So it really made a great example of OFT in nature. Kind of experiment, there are always constraints, there are always limitations. And so the thing, really, when it comes down to it, is we set up our experiment. Our experiment worked pretty well. I liked it, but I'm going to see what you guys think too, and see if you guys think that it could be changed in any way, that we can make it better. But hold off for that for 1 second, and think about this. With OFT, there are constraints, right? Theoretically, it sounds great that we have foraging over, well, the foraging profit over the travel and the time, but the deal really is, are there other things that we're not considering? Now think about this. There's fitness, right? Can an animal survive and reproduce, right? Support its young and make its gene pool, or make its genes spread throughout that particular population, so its genes are in that population for a very long period of time. It increases its fitness. Now, with OFT doesn't take into consideration something like a squirrel caching its nuts. Think about that. A squirrel is usually going to grab its nuts, and then it's going to store those nuts for the winter time when the food isn't available anymore. So with OFT, we're looking at travel and time, but one of the constraints is that when we think about OFT, we're not thinking about, one, what they're going to do when they're going to cache their food, when they're going to store it for later and not eat it then. Two, think about this. If you were trying to support your young because you're trying to increase your fitness, wouldn't you want to get your young a lot of food? And if you want to get your young a lot of food, then OFT only considers the individual itself. And it only takes in consideration, remember, energy and the efficiency of how much food we're grabbing, how much energy we're obtaining, and the cost and benefit to that. So the real big constraint with this whole situation is the idea that there are things like reproduction, storing up food so then you can have babies. Also, helping those babies, so grabbing the food and bringing it back for another individual instead of just yourself to get the energy. And also for animals that are like squirrels or bears that are hibernating in the winter or anything else, right? The idea of storing more food than you actually need at the time because there's a benefit later. So there were a lot of constraints in our particular experiment, which really makes OFT just like another concept in science. It's very difficult to take the theory and try and test it in an experimental way. So now that we've actually seen my experiment, what I'd like you guys to do right now is we're going to pause the video, and I'd like you guys to jot on that same note paper that you were jotting down your buffet selections. I'd like you to take a moment, and I'd like you to think about, how could I and my young science friends have improved our study? Do you have any thoughts? All right, so now that we've actually taken in the theoretical and experimental kind of applications of OFT, we need to just recap real quick. Optimal foraging theorem is a theorem that's talking about animals obtaining energy, how they obtain energy, and the efficiency in which they have it. When we think about that equation, we have to think to ourselves that there is a foraging profit, how much food we can take in, and the energy that we're getting from it, and that's divided by the travel time plus the traveling distance that the animal has to go through to get that particular food and energy. So there's a cost and there's a benefit to obtaining energy. We've recapped all that stuff. What I'd really like you guys to do is I'd like you to pause the video and I'd like you to jot down some thoughts. If you were to tell your little brother or sister who didn't know anything about ecology or anything about energy and obtaining energy and all that kind of good stuff with food, I'd like you to try and think about, how would you actually discuss this stuff with your smaller or littler brother and sister, or just a kid who's didn't take the class yet, and try and tell them about OFT. And think to yourself this too. I'd like you to think of some kinds of discussion questions that you're going to bring in tomorrow that maybe we can talk about, where we can think about the different kinds of constraints, the different ways that we could set up an experiment, and I'd like you to think about the idea of the efficiency of food. So after you wrote down those little discussion questions and thoughts that you had, think about the idea of the efficiency of food. Let's go back to our buffet scenario from the beginning of this video. What were the foods that you put down on that piece of paper? What kinds of macromolecules were actually pertaining to each of the foods you chose? Look at that particular list and think to yourself, now that you know about optimal foraging theorem, if you went back to that buffet and we had any kinds of foods to select, what kinds of foods would now be on your plate? Would you change that list? I'm going to challenge you guys to create your own example, your own analogy of how you can apply the optimal foraging theorem to a daily experience in your life. Don't think about the ones where you have the off period. And don't think about the buffet scenario. Is there another way that you could actually show me that you understand OFT in a regular daily example? Think about what you do after school. Think about what you do when you go home. Think about what you do on your daily life, right? How does OFT actually apply? A little bit more difficult for something like a human being that can end up getting the buffet whenever it wants, huh?